Hello everyone again, my name is Haley Washko, and today we are, again, going to be talking about the federal election system. This time we are going to be talking about the executive branch. However, only the head of the executive branch, who's the president, is elected, so that's who we're going to be talking about. If you have not watched my previous video on congressional elections, I highly suggest that you go and do so because the kind of democracy that we are is explained really good in there, and so it might make a little more sense. But before we begin, I just want to send another reminder to everyone that states are in charge of their own elections with a few rules and regulations on how they are conducted. And since all 50 states have their own unique constitutions, I cannot get into the specifics. However, I can explain the basics of how we do or maybe don't get the people in office that we vote for. First, I want to look at the 22nd Amendment. It was ratified in 1951 and says, "No person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice." This officially sets the two-term limits on presidents. You may be thinking, wait, wasn't that already a thing? Nope. George Washington made that a tradition, but FDR served 4 terms. That would have been 16 years if he hadn't died while in office. The amendment also says that no one can serve longer than 10 years. This is only for the vice president if he has to take over for the president, or whoever else has to take over for the president. Let me show you how he can get 10 years real quick so we understand. So let's say this is the term, and unfortunately, the president can no longer serve for whatever reason. If it is deemed and the vice president takes over in the first 2 years, he can only do 1 term. He can only run for 1 term. However, if the president is deemed that he can no longer serve in the later 2 terms, the vice president can run for 2 more terms. That's not saying he's necessarily going to get it, but he can run still. Before I get into how the Electoral College comes into play, we have to decide who competes with the Electoral College for the presidency. This is where primaries and conventions come into play. As I said before, each state has its own unique way of conducting elections, but I will explain the 4 main ways that primaries are held in states. Primaries are used to decide which candidates are going to compete with each other for the presidency using the Electoral College. So this is kind of like the preliminary knockouts, kind of like before you get to playoffs in a sport game. First, we have closed primaries. This means that you can only vote for a candidate from the party that you are registered to. If you are a Democrat, you can only vote for a Democrat. Unfortunately, since independents are not officially registered with a party, they cannot vote. They may identify with the Green Party or Libertarian Party, but they're checked off in their official registration as independent, meaning no affiliation to a party. The second option is an open primary. This means that you can vote for either party. You can still only vote once, so you can't vote for a Republican and a Democrat, but you do get to pick which candidate from whichever party you want. So you can choose, I'm going to vote for a Democrat this time, or you can say, I'm going to vote for a Republican this time. It does not matter, you just can't vote more than twice. Independents can vote in open primaries because, again, you don't need to be registered with a specific party for this. There are both positives and negatives of open primaries. Some argue that since you have independents voting, the victorious candidate may be more moderate. However, some really mean person may vote for a candidate from the opposite party that they know has no chance of winning the presidency. For example, if I'm a Democrat and I say, I feel confident in our candidates, but, there's this one Republican guy that I know could not win the presidency if he gets elected. So you know what? I'm going to go vote for him and hope that he makes it in so that my Democratic candidate will become president. I'm not just calling Democrats out on that. That can happen with Republicans too. I would just use it for an example. The third, it's not technically a primary. It's called a caucus. And it's really just a meeting where the members of parties go and they meet and they decide who they're going to nominate as their choice for a candidate. This isn't used that much. It is used in a couple states, but not many. And then, a newer method that is increasing in popularity is the top 2 method. This is when everybody is on a ballot. So Democrats and Republicans, they're all on the same ballot. And the two that get the top vote move on in the general election. It doesn't matter if they're both Republicans, both Democrats, or one and the other. Just whichever candidates get the most votes move on. So let's say the top two candidates up here get more votes. This bottom guy right here, he's out. He's done. These two are moving forward. So now we're going to talk about conventions, and parties are in charge of their own conventions. So parties typically take, the popular vote from each state or whatever, and they nominate their candidate in whichever unique way the party decides. There are delegates, like in the Electoral College, which I'm going to be explaining in a minute, and sometimes there are superdelegates, which is more so used by the Democratic Party than the Republican Party, but that's where the vote of a superdelegate is a bit more heavily weighed than the vote of a regular delegate. At a convention, the vice president and party platform are also announced. So this is kind of where it kind of picks up and you get into the real, all right, this is it, president or not. Now I want to mention the 12th Amendment, and this says, they shall name in their ballots the person voted for as president, and in distinct ballots, the person voted for as vice president. This means that the vice president and president are cast on separate ballots. This is a result of the 1800 election. The House of Representatives had to break a tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. If you don't know anything about this, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr were kind of running mates, if you will. And because when you would vote, your one vote would go towards the president and the other would go to the vice president, you would have the president and the person running as vice president technically would tie. And you'd be like, well, okay, but, now we gotta vote again. So they changed it so that now you have very distinct, okay, this is who's nominated for president, this is who's nominated for vice president. Plain and simple. Okay, now we're going to get into the complicated stuff, which is the Electoral College. So we're going to take this nice and slow. The first thing that you should know is that the Electoral College has a total of 538 votes, divided between the 50 states. And each state gets a minimum of 3. They're guaranteed at least 3 votes. And D.C. is also guaranteed 3 as of the 23rd Amendment. It's a winner-take-all system, which means that if you had 3 candidates, okay, all running for something, and they're all competing for 20 electoral votes, your first candidate, now this is not proportional at all, but let's say your first candidate gets 15,000 people to vote for him. Your second candidate gets 14,999 candidates to vote for her. Or not candidates, I'm sorry. People, citizens, just ordinary, everyday voting. Okay, so 15,000 people vote for candidate number 1, 14,999 people vote for candidate number 2, and 10 people vote for candidate number 3. Let's just assume that number 3 is a third-party candidate. Sorry. So in a winner-take-all system, the candidate number 1 right here would get all 20 of these votes, even though he only beat her by 1 popular vote. Plain and simple. He gets 20. Maine and Nebraska, however, do proportional representation, where candidate number 1 with 15,000 might get 9 votes, candidate number 2 might get 8 votes, and candidate number 3 might get 3 votes. Okay? So that's what proportional representation looks like versus winner-take-all. Electors, who are people, are the ones that vote for the president. Not us not us citizens, but specific electors vote for the president. And candidates typically choose their own electors. So Donald Trump, let's take the 2016 election for an example. Donald Trump would take 538 people from across all different states, and he would say, can you vote for me? Can you vote for me? Can you vote for me? Can you vote for me if I win this state? And they say yes. And then Hillary Clinton would do the same thing. So in total, there's 1,076 electors, technically, between the 2 major party candidates. And the votes are officially counted on January 6th. However, we typically know the next day, after the polls are taken, who is the winner because we understand how our system works. So we don't have to wait until January 6th, thank goodness. Also, a candidate needs 270 electoral votes to win, so that's a majority. Now, some of you are probably wondering how we decide which state gets how many votes for the Electoral College. It's actually a math formula that's very simple. It's the number of senators, which, as we know from my previous video, is always 2, plus the number of representatives in the House, which again we know is based on population size, and that's how many electoral votes you get. So let's take California for an example. They have 2 senators and 53 representatives. So they have a total of 55 electoral college votes. Like anything man-made, however, there's flaws. So the first flaw is that the popular winner may not win the presidency. Now, this has only happened 5 times so far. However, as I'm sure you all know, the most recent example, which is Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton. Another flaw is that electors might get a little bit sneaky. Electors don't have to vote for the winner of their state's popular votes. They can just place their vote for whichever candidate they want, because it's not written in the Constitution. They're not legally bound to voting for that candidate. This has only happened 11 times so far, and it hasn't changed the results of the election those 11 times it did happen. However, this is also really unlikely because, as I mentioned before, the candidates choose their own electors, so they're not going to choose someone who they know might be persuaded at the last second to vote for the opposite candidate. They're going to choose someone they know is die hard, go big, go home, I'm voting for you, doesn't matter what you do right now. And the third flaw is if there's a tie. The Constitution tasks the House of Representatives with deciding who gets the win in case of a tie. However, if this happens, each state only gets 1 electoral vote. So, total, there's going to be 50 votes. And this doesn't sound like such a big deal until you think about it. California, which has 39 million people, would be just as represented and their vote would be just as weighed as heavily as North Dakota, which has 750,000 people, which doesn't seem totally proportional and fair. I also want to mention the 20th Amendment because though it doesn't have to do with elections, it does have to do with what happens after we elect the president. And this says, the terms of the president and the vice president shall end at noon on the 20th day of January, and the terms of their successors shall then begin. This is called the lame duck amendment because before, it would be months between the elections, who gets to win, and them getting inaugurated. So now, since there's less of a wait, more gets done because, once you know who the next president is, you're really not going to listen to the current president. They're really sitting in the office useless pretty much after that point. So now you have less of a wait period between, so more things can get done. And again, I just wanted to mention before I go that the President and Senate work together to appoint federal judges. Though federal judges are not directly elected by the people, we do kind of elect them in our own special way.